On the Gary Bisbee Show, here are practical lessons from today's healthcare insiders. We'll uncover stories about their challenges, paths to success, and the skills that they've developed, as together we'll explore how the healthcare economy is transforming. Aaron Martin left Amazon after 9 years to join Providence as Chief Digital Officer and Managing General Partner of Providence Ventures. We'll find out what attracted Aaron to Providence and what contributions he's made while there. The benefits of leading Providence's digital evolution and investing in forward-looking products and services places Aaron at the cutting edge of healthcare transformation. We discuss what makes outstanding leaders and why it's necessary to hold on to them. Aaron uses words like passion, inspiration, and tenacious. Aaron describes in practical terms why it's important for top leaders to take ownership of their situation, how they're intellectually curious, and why they seek coaching. He describes a term used at Amazon, vocally self-critical, and why that characteristic is found in great leaders. He reviews what he's learned about matching leaders with the right opportunity to bring out their enthusiasm, energy, and determination. Aaron describes trends in digitization and investing. He outlines the future of digitization in healthcare, and he describes the continuous online experience that Providence is building. We wrap up with Aaron's counsel to up-and-coming leaders, and he references investors who are exceptional at developing and cultivating great leaders. Well, good morning, Aaron, and welcome.
Morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're pleased to have you at the microphone. You and I have chatted live on a number of interviews, but this will be our first one on video, so looking forward to it for sure. You know, we're all about leadership and learning on this show. I'd like to just dive right into some questions about leadership and how you view leadership. And one of them is, just looking back on your career, what are the main lessons that you've learned about leadership?
I think one of the things that I've learned is there are things that you can coach and teach, and things that are a little bit more kind of that you kind of seek out in individuals. And the things that are harder to coach and teach are what I would call ownership. So somebody who just really, really, you have to almost convince them to kind of let go of an issue, to stop kind of pushing forward. These folks are not very common, and when you find them, you hold on to them with both hands, right? Because they're incredibly valuable, and they're a lot easier to kind of coach to take more time off, decompress, those types of things, versus you're kind of putting the nickel rods in the reactor versus trying to convince somebody to, really, really care about something. And the other thing I found is that intersection is usually around, are they doing something that's close to their ultimate passion, right? So I've seen some people have, incredibly low levels of ownership, in an area that they just don't care about, but then you kind of switch roles, and then all of a sudden you see them being inspired, and things just kind of take off and click. And so the other, piece of it too is, the old adage of making sure everybody's sitting on the right kind of in the right area on the bus, making sure that they're really, I think Jim Collins used that analogy. So I think ownership is a huge issue. And again, it has to do with, I would say some kind of natural tendencies that people have and their upbringing, et cetera. But I think a lot of it also has to do with, matching them to the right opportunity.
So on the ownership point, you're almost saying, which actually is something I believe, but let's test this. You're almost saying that we have natural athletes and natural musicians. There are kind of natural leaders that have characteristics that kind of direct them toward ownership and leadership. Is that true? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think to some extent, but again, I think it's also about, matching them with, something that they get energy out of, so somebody who's super motivated, and another kind of danger is I've also seen people who are incredibly good at something, that they don't enjoy, and they pursue it in their career. And that's where burnout happens, right? And that's where kind of, career missteps happen, where you see somebody who is really, really great at a specific area, and and they're getting rewarded for it, right? And so they naturally continue to kind of pursue that, but they're just not getting any energy out of it, right? Out of what they're doing.
Used to see that in investment banking a lot when I was there, is that people would be really good at it, economically quite rewarding, but they really didn't want to do it.
Yeah, and I always say that there's like this kind of matrix of like, what you get energy out of and what you're good at. That's the sweet spot. You know, what you get energy out of and you're not very good at, that's a hobby. You know, and I'm a musician, and I'm kind of mediocre, and I love it, and I get energy out of it, but I wouldn't want to make a career out of it. My boss, Rod Hockman, one time heard me play, and he's like, don't quit your day job. Words out of his mouth. So
Well, is important, obviously. Do you find that those natural leaders are those where you have a match between their passion and their vocation? Do they tend to be learners? Do they tend to learn more and learn faster than others, do you think?
yeah, I think they do. They respond really well to coaching. They are intellectually curious, and again, I think it's they have to be in an area that they care about and they've got a passion around, right? So it's hard to be intellectually curious about something you don't care about, right? And it's hard to be, respond really well to coaching if you're kind of, doing something you're just kind of mildly interested in, if at all. Because, why go to the bother? So I think, step one is, assume they have the natural proclivity, and that your job as a leader is to make sure that there's a good match with, what they're doing. And sometimes that match isn't within your organization. You got to make sure that you find that. And you know, I think the other thing too is I'm getting to the point in my career where I'm starting to realize that um, you know when I look back on my career, it's not going to be about like the cool businesses I was involved in, or the projects, et cetera, et cetera. It's about helping the building the careers that that I've mentored and coached people through. And I spent 9 years at Amazon, and I will tell you the proudest day was not one of our launches, was not one of our, some sort of, meeting with Bezos or something like that. It was, I'll never forget. I was in a meeting with my boss, and for the first time, he had brought together. We had just reorganized and moved over to Kindle, and for the first time ever, he had brought his directs together, and everybody was introducing themselves to the group. And I think there were like I want to say 10 people there, and 7 of the 10 were people that I'd either hired or managed at one point and led. And my boss basically stopped the discussion. He's like, Aaron, you've hired like the vast majority of my leadership team, and that just made me super proud. Like when he was in his own way complimenting me, but that was the proudest moment in my career at Amazon.
Well, what's the characteristic that you look for, just to follow up on that? What's the characteristic that you look for when you hire somebody? Obviously, it relates to the particular job they're going to do, but are there certain characteristics that really you're looking for regardless of what they're going to do?
I look for energy, grit, determination, and what at Amazon we would call vocally self-critical. So energy is clear. So is somebody just passionate, and it doesn't have to be somebody bouncing off the walls. It could be just you can just tell that somebody's energetic, and what they're trying to do. They've got energy around, and it can be very subtle, laid back, but it can still you can tell that they're really passionate about something. If the people are kind of dismissive and too cool for school, I'm not into cynicism, and I'm not into like cynics, right? So I want somebody who's a true believer in what they're doing, right? Because why bother otherwise? So that's it. Tales of situations in which and I can say this about myself personally. I have in some in some cases in my career, had an irrational level of perseverance, right? Uh, like, like probably not good idea, to kind of continue down the path that I was in. And, it was a learning situation. I can think of several different situations where I should have just like, taken my head up and taken a look around and said, does this really make sense what I'm up to? But I will tell you that if well directed, that is an incredible feature, not a bug for most people. And then the other thing is vocally self-critical. So can somebody learn by understanding what their mistakes are and take feedback? And it's one of those things where Amazon was a very forming experience for me as a leader. And one of the things that they taught us was, you know, you either took the feedback personally and didn't get very far within the organization, or you really understood that it wasn't personal and they're trying to improve you, right? And it's every single opportunity to kind of improve. And I remember, in kind of year two or year three, I was there for 9 years, figuring that out. And you just kind of get over this bridge of like, wow, I'm actually going to improve at a geometric rate if I listen to this feedback and I process it and I incorporate it. And it's exhausting sometimes, like there are days that you want to go to work and you just don't want to be told how you can do something better or different, so it is kind of continuous. So, but yeah, I think, being able to kind of process feedback and improve yourself, I think is another thing. That's growth.
Thinking about your capacity for leadership, maybe going all the way back to your parents, do you think you picked up any characteristics of leadership from your parents?
Yeah, absolutely. For my dad, ethics. So I think the number one thing, even before the other areas, is are you always going to do the right thing? And he grew up in business in an era where, in the 70s, I would say that, despite all the problems we've had recently, I will tell you, it from at least his telling of it, corporate America was a lot less ethical. There was a lot kind of more kind of loosey goosey stuff going on, and he left corporate America to go into academics because of that, because he just couldn't stomach the lack of kind of ethical clarity. And so he really kind of reinforced that with me, every single day growing up. Also, I grew up in an economist household, so I was the dorky kid that in the economics classes would get the jokes and laugh out loud, and everybody else would kind of stare at me like, what's wrong with him? And so I had very, very uh, odd upbringing. But one thing it also taught me was, you always hear the expression, "There's no free lunch." I'm always looking for, this was reinforced at Amazon because Bezos was fundamentally kind of came out of a hedge fund, right? And so it was reinforced in me that like how do you build self-reinforcing loops that can sustain themselves. Don't depend solely on on people's efforts and good intentions, and try to create mechanisms, right, for things to perpetuate themselves, and business models, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of grew up learning about that. And then on my mom's side, empathy and compassion. So my mom was a computer scientist, and she also was just the one that was like, it was the yin and the yang, right? So she was the one that really kind of taught me kind of, how to be empathetic.
50 or 60% of our listeners on this show are up and comers. They're 40 years old or less. What advice would you have for an up and comer, perhaps somebody that works for you or somebody that might be listening, about leadership?
Yeah, I think the key thing, I would tell them is, just kind of looking at my career, I really, really kind of prize the experiences that I have had, but I would do them probably in a different sequence. So I, you know, did a lot of work on, kind of, after my undergraduate and consulting, and then I went to business school. I did some more consulting at McKinsey, and that was a great finishing school where I learned kind of problem solving. Then I started my first business, with my co-founder in banking and financial services software, and then I started a second one. Then I went to Amazon, and I got to see what technology at scale really looked like. What I would, what I would do is probably reverse some of that order if I had it to kind of do over again, which is, if your ultimate ambition is to start your own company, kind of do it in the sequence of, learn, problem solve, see scale, then start a business, and so like I would, what I always kind of tell folks is if they're kind of on the path of like they want to be a CEO of their own company or found their own company, um, get some formal training in the basics. One way of doing it is an MBA. It's not the only way you could do it, but like what I learned at Wharton was, the reason why I picked that business school was they're going to teach me a set of very, very, um, very specific learnable skills that are kind of classroom based, so like finance and accounting and those types of things. So the business acumen. So, check that off. And then what McKinsey taught me was problem solving, so structured problem solving, right? And then what I wish I had done next was go to Amazon to where I could learn the leadership principles and the scaling and seeing like what works and what doesn't with consumers. Because the great thing about working at Amazon was, and the same thing as Google, same thing with Apple, any of these big scale, Microsoft, et cetera, is Amazon has 300 million customers going through its platform, and you can kind of accelerate the rate of how fast a startup grows. And you can kind of see what works and what doesn't in kind of, accelerated time, right? So it's like listening to a podcast on like, 2x, right? You can get through it faster and you get to the end faster and you can still kind of consume the information. Whereas when you're kind of starting a business, um, a lot of the work is just the basic block and tackling of putting the infrastructure in place, trying to generate demand, getting customers to use the platform. So there's a lot of signal to noise issues. And so I think knowing a lot of that up front matters. And then also, go to a place like, like an Amazon or, a big organization like Providence, which is great around teaching the servant leadership, ideas. Go somewhere where you can really learn leadership. Work for a great startup leader, but I think the leadership piece is and the management piece is really helpful before you go and raise money and before you go start a business. I'm all about kind of preparation and and getting ready for that because I cringe all the time about like some of the decisions I made in my first startup. That I had I done it in a different sequence, I would have been like, oh, that's like a no brainer. Don't do that, right? The other thing too is read, read, read. Like the answers are out there, so like like cheat, like go copy off of somebody else's test, like so like a great book is The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. Like he tells you everything that you're going to go screw up, even if you know about it ahead of time. But at least he's giving you the warning, like here are the leadership kind of missteps you're going to make as a startup CEO. That's all about kind of becoming a, kind of a founder CEO. I think, there's probably other kind of lessons if you want kind of different, career paths, down the road. So like for venture, et cetera. But that, if you're looking to found your own business, that would be my advice.
I love your point about sequencing and thinking about specific leadership experiences and kind of stacking them up in order. We don't always have that luxury, but it sure is helpful if we can think in those terms. I think that's very useful advice.
And to your point, sometimes timing matters more than anything, right? So what Bezos would tell you is, he's clearly a genius, but man, right person at the right place at the right time, recognize the opportunity, right? Same thing with, Zuckerberg or whoever. If they'd been 2 years later or 2 years earlier, debatable whether or not they would have been as successful. So sometimes the opportunity or the idea is timed right. So, and that's the case, ignore everything I just said, right? You've got to, the timing matters more than anything.
That's really, really good advice. Let's turn to Providence now, Aaron, and you've got two titles, Chief Digital Officer and Managing General Partner of Providence Ventures, but really wear three hats if you include marketing in there. But I think the first question is, what drew you from Amazon to Providence to begin with?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is, I'll never forget the day that I was approached by a headhunter, a guy that I knew in executive search from McKinsey, and he would, ping me about some job at some other big tech company, and I said, I think I'm working for one of the best big tech companies. Why would I move and leave? And then one day he calls me up and he said, I've got this really weird out of left field opportunity. I'm going to say two words to you. Don't hang up. Nonprofit healthcare. Are you still there? And I was like, what? And I don't even think he knew that I had a healthcare background, before business school or, before my startups and technology. And he said, you've got to meet these two guys, Rod Hochman and Mike Butler. They are disruptive, kind of game changing, thought leaders in healthcare, health system executives. They're really thinking disruptively, and all the words coming out of his mouth generally didn't fit in the same sentence for me, like just based on what I knew, previously about healthcare. And so I was just out of curiosity. I wanted to meet him. And so I met them and it was all true. And what was amazing was, Rod and Mike were thinking about digital 7 years ago before it was even close to a thing. And when the entire industry was really focused on the ACA rollout, right? And Medicaid expansion. And they just knew that, I remember having a discussion with Rod about you know, like the disruption that's going to be coming. And he said, if we don't do it and we don't initiate it, somebody else will, and we're going to be kind of sitting in a back seat where we have no control over the steering wheel. And so he's absolutely right. So we're fortunate that we got started 7 years ago and got a head start, if you will.
How did you define the chief digital officer role?
Yeah, that kind of evolved. When I first got there, I was in charge of strategy and innovation, and honestly, it was like a placeholder title. I didn't know what it meant, and most other people had no earthly idea what it meant. And I started looking outside of healthcare for, at industries that were probably easily 10, 15 years ahead of us. And a lot of them were hiring chief digital officers. And the problem that they were trying to solve by hiring that role was, I'm in an industry that has consumer engagement, right? Is dealing with consumers in a largely offline world. How do I transition those relationships online to digital, right? And they would hire these chief digital officers. A lot of them had the exact same background I did, coming from Google or Amazon or a place like that, into say retail or fintech, financial services, et cetera, right? And so I really just kind of copied and pasted what that role is, into kind of my world. And in my role, the way I see it is, our health system has a largely, offline, episodic relationship with consumers, and because we deliver care when people are sick, and most people, fortunately, are very healthy. So we see patients kind of 2.5 times a year on average, right? So how do you change a very episodic, non-engaged relationship to a highly that's offline, move it online, make it very, very continuously engaged about people's health between episodes of care? So, kind of moving those relationships from offline to online, and then also making them kind of a continuous engagement versus just seeing them 2.5 times a year. And the reason why that last part is so important and is so critical is because, if you don't have that continuous engagement with with your consumers, you're open to disruption. I mean, you're basically, you are Woolworths, you are Blockbuster, you are, name the incumbent that didn't succeed. It's because they had a bad relationship that was not continuous with their consumer. If you look at what Amazon's done, they built Prime. Prime is an engagement platform, and that's that's how they're solving that problem, right? That they had infrequent purchases, and how do they stay relevant in people's lives, kind of, on a day-to-day basis.
Applying that to healthcare is a capitation sort of model, I suppose, where somebody is kind of associated with a particular provider, and there's a set of names and experiences that can be continuous. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so it helps. I think what I'm talking about helps under the financial model that we're talking about, but it's not sufficient. So if you just have, patients that are, responsibility for covered lives, but you're not engaging them continuously, you're still in the same boat. So the example I always tell people is what we found out at Providence is we did a calculation, and we calculated, we're a $26 billion organization. We calculated that for every 1% reduction in churn, which is a measurement of the lack of engagement, right? So how much do customers turn over within our ecosystem? For every 1% reduction in that, we get $100 million benefit to the bottom line. That's a massive economic lever. And so a lot of, healthcare folks will tell me, well, Aaron, the reason for that, a lot of that churn is people switching coverage, they go from employer to employer, et cetera, et cetera. And in a lot of cases, maybe the payer will kind of change networks, et cetera, et cetera. And my pushback to them is to say, look, if Providence creates this continuous relationship with someone that's so good, it will be very hard for a payer to take us out of the network, right? So even under like a contractual switch, it'd be very, very tough for them to say to their employees, I know you've got this long-term kind of established relationship with Providence that is like you use them daily, let's say, but we're going to take them out of the network, right? That's going to be a tough putt for them. So it creates stickiness just for consumers who are out shopping, but also, under, contractual negotiations as well. So it's valuable in that context also.
So, to follow up on that, when did you pick up marketing and how does that relate to the continuous online experience that you're after?
I'll tell you kind of the two kind of improvement loops. And remember, I was talking about how I learned at Amazon and growing up, like you got to create these kind of self-reinforcing cycles. On the digital side and marketing, how those two things relate is it's going to be really, really difficult for you to kind of create a process for kind of, a great customer experience without owning the demand generation part of it, right? And so, and you see this very typically outside of healthcare to where either chief digital officer reports to the chief marketing officer or vice versa, right? And you see that all the time outside of healthcare. And the way it works for us is, we're investing in a brand. And so that basically makes sure that people, have just general name recognition, about Providence. But then there's these in and outbound, platforms for kind of attracting customers into, our platform. And inbound is, a digital set of platforms like SEO, SEM, and local that if you're expressing an intent on the internet of saying, like, you do a search on Google and you're saying you're looking for care, you've got a condition or you're looking for a physician, we always want to be the first thing that you find, the first option that you find in that search. And then we want to push you through a really, really seamless digital transaction so that we can kind of get you into our ecosystem. And then we get you into an engagement platform that we talked about just a few minutes ago. So that's how the marketing and digital have to kind of work together. On the Prov Ventures side, how those two things work together is an innovation cycle where basically we go out and we look for needle moving opportunities for digital, where digital will really help with the customer experience or improve clinical outcomes or improve operations. And we stack rank those, work with our clinical and operations colleagues to determine which ones we're going to go after. And then we walk it through a process. And step one is, in our current technology portfolio, do we already own a solution to the problem? If so, stop there, implement that, because we don't want to spend money on something new if we've already got something in the portfolio. But then if we don't have something, then we give it to Prov Ventures and they go out and they look for what we call best of breed. And if they can't, what they'll look for are companies that absolutely crush that problem. And how it kind of relates to the investing side is because we know that this is a big issue or big problem, we know by definition that that total addressable market is massive, right? Because if it's a big problem for us, it's a big problem for our colleagues. And so we know that they're probably going to sell a lot of that service or technology or whatever it may be across the industry. And if we don't have it and we can't find it, then we also have 110 product and engineering folks that will go build it. And so out of the 23 portfolio companies that we have in our $300 million Providence Venture Fund, 3 of them are companies we invented. So we incubated within our organization. So we'll actually create a brand new company where we see innovation white space, where we don't see a good solution in the market, and we'll spin them out. And so that's kind of how, the marketing side kind of relates to digital, and how the innovation side, how Providence Ventures relates to digital. It's kind of two reinforcing loops that, improve the efficiency of the platform.
Well, just as an aside, how many unicorns are connected to Providence Ventures?
Yeah, 20. So we have 23 active portfolio companies in our in our portfolio. 4 are currently unicorns. We're hoping for a 5th here pretty soon. One is literally on the edge, and and then we've got a lot of hope for a couple of more. And again, it's how the platform works, because if you just kind of are disciplined about what I was talking about, which is you go and you talk to the clinicians and the operators. That's where the gold is for us. They know where the problems are, and we work with them to kind of define what those problems are and how digital may help. But then, but that is where the gold is. That's where the value is, because if there's an opportunity to improve operations or clinical outcomes or customer experience, and it's a big one, and it's in the top 10 of what we're working on, by definition, it's a big total addressable market. Then it becomes a challenge of just selecting the right management team.
We've had the term personalization enter into our healthcare lives in the last several years. Just thinking about that, how do you address that thought of personalization with what you're doing on the innovation front, with what you're doing on a digital front, and continuous online marketing and so on?
Yeah, personalization is really important generally outside of healthcare. Within healthcare, it's critical, because the entire thing about healthcare is that personal experience. And what we think about is we have been deploying a lot of resources against this. And so the biggest project that we're just now kind of completing is I always kind of joke with my team, is that, like, it's the biggest project we don't want anybody to know about, because if we did, it means it broke, which is the ability to do, it's called single sign-on, but it's the ability for a patient to sign on with one login credential in any kind of digital property that we've got today. That's fairly commonplace outside of healthcare. Within healthcare, it's very rare. Typically, within healthcare, we ask patients to create new credentials for every offering, re-log in all the time. It's kind of the online version of how dysfunctional the offline health system can be. And so we're getting rid of that to where you can have a single kind of identity across all of our different platforms. And then once you have that single identity, then once a patient is kind of logged in, we can provide personalized experiences for them. So we can say, based on your clinical condition, based on content you've searched on before, based on requests that you've made, with us, we can serve up additional content to be helpful in improving your health. And then that improves, what is kind of commonly referred to as population health at scale. So, you're not getting, the typical approach in population health is you're getting kind of not very personalized messages for, say, for instance, if I'm pre-diabetic, I'm going to get the same message as the younger female pre-diabetic and the older male pre-diabetic. That makes no sense, right? We have different kind of life experiences, and I might need something slightly different in terms of to make it effective for me. So personalization really, really matters in healthcare, and it's a very developed set of technologies from my prior experience at Amazon, they were masters at personalization, but it comes from other technology. Google is incredible about it. Obviously, Apple is as well. Every digital experience you have today is personalized at some level.
Putting your Providence Ventures hat on for a moment, let's say you're looking for a CEO to lead one of your companies. If you could ask a candidate one question to assess how well they would perform as CEO, what would that be, Aaron?
Yeah, I think the key thing is, and I'm borrowing this from my my colleagues at uh, at Venrock, right? So Bob Kocher and Brian Roberts, and they talk about this all the time, and we're invested in a couple of their in their portfolio companies, and they're just I think they're the probably the best investors in healthcare. And one of the things that they do really really well is they find um, incredibly smart, capable CEOs to go after very big opportunities. And one of the things they screen for in that is they call it truth seeking, right? And that seems like a obvious thing, but like, when you're in a startup and you're really struggling and you're trying to kind of make something happen, there is all kinds of self delusion at work, because you're under a ton of stress. You're always about to run out of money. You're always, trying to get, convince investors and customers to kind of come along for the ride and that kind of thing. And it takes a special kind of talent to kind of just say, is this really what's true? And are the facts pointing in the right direction? To kind of point me in this towards this opportunity. And is this going to is this ultimately going to work? Is there a gravitational pull, right, in this direction ultimately? Um, because again, where you see startups fail a lot is, you know, it's one thing to fail quickly and not burn a ton of money. Like that is like pardonable all the time. It's a lot harder to kind of fail and burn a ton of money because you kind of keep telling yourself and investors a story that's just not true, right? And and in some cases, to their defense, the data is ambivalent, but in a lot of cases, it's clear. It's just that you just don't want to kind of wake up and smell the coffee, and you figure you're gonna figure it out along the way and find the real opportunity, right? That truth seeking, I think, is absolutely critical for CEOs. And if you look at our portfolio, that is a commonality across all of our CEOs, which is, in every conversation, they're very fact based and they're very trying to focus on what is the truth about, the gravitational pull that is going to ultimately end up in, kind of healthcare moving in this direction or that direction. And then, the other thing too is we talked about this before, it might be timing. So something may be true in 4 or 5 years or 6 or 7 years. If you start now, you may be too early, right? So that's the other thing too, is that's where the timing really matters as well. So it's got to be true, and it's got to happen in a time frame in which you can do something about it. So it can't be true from a couple of years ago, and it can't be true in 10 years. It's got to be, those things that you've also got to select the timing, which is really really difficult as well.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You talked about sequencing earlier, and now we're talking about timing and just truthfulness, both in terms of the discipline of your thinking as well as positioning, and those are three great thoughts. This has been an absolutely terrific interview, Aaron, which was expected certainly. Let's wrap up, if we could, with one little bit longer term question. If you thought about uh, the decade that we're in now over the next 10 years, what do you think the number one issue is going to be? If we were to do this interview at the end of this decade and we look back, what do you think the number one health issue that we're going to address will be?
I think it's going to be the same thing that we've been dealing with over the past 10 years, but it's going to get worse. Um, just because of the demographics and the way society is trending, which is chronic diseases, you know, and and mental and behavioral health. I think those things are massive challenges that are going to get worse before they get better. And we're throwing a lot of technology at them, so that makes me hopeful. But I think that the size and the scale of the problem is just incredible. And I think you know, there's technology things that can kind of tilt the curve, probably plus or minus 10%, right? 20% maybe. But a lot of this has to do with a bigger societal set of issues, right? So I think, fundamentally, um, we're on a path as a society, especially in America, that is unsustainable for the individual, and you're seeing it in a way it kind of expresses itself around, I would just call them a whole series of addictions, right? Self-medication of like, you can self-medicate by telling yourself untrue conspiracy theories, right? So that's one way that you've seen in our politics. You can self-medicate because that'll make you feel empowered, right? You can self-medicate by eating too much. You can self-medicate by, drug abuse and alcohol abuse. You can not self-medicate and be driven to despair and anxiety and depression. And oh, by the way, there's other kind of self medications also have the added extra benefit of depression, anxiety. So you don't get away from it, right? So I think I think I think there is a bigger fundamental problem that we as a society have to kind of reconcile against, which is and COVID pushed, kind of pointed a lot of these frailties out and kind of sped them up and accentuated them, right? Like nothing, no, you've already got kind of a bad trend, and then you put everybody into a pressure cooker, and you see how worse it can get. And I think, we as a society need to kind of take a step back and kind of reflect on what's been going on, because I think the stuff that we're dealing with as a health system are all symptomatic. I don't think they're causal. I think they're symptomatic of a larger set of just of issues around people not being connected to each other in a genuine way, spirituality, those types of things that that could end up breaking our society if we don't do something about it.
I agree with that, Aaron. I mean, the world we live in, chronic disease, um, is all going to relate to affordability, which may end up being that kind of impetus that you're talking about with COVID over the longer haul is affordability. This has been a great interview. Actually, we kind of ended on a down note there. That wasn't by design, but love the work you're doing. You're just terrific. You're a great inspiration to many of us, and we're delighted that you made that move to healthcare from Amazon some years ago.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and thank you so much for asking me to do this. This is wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you, Gary.